Peppa woke up in complete darkness. No sound, no glimmer of light, as if the world had vanished. She looked around, but George wasn't there. The house was silent, and even the walls felt unfamiliar. Peppa's hoof touched George's toy dinosaur on the floor, but George himself seemed to have dissolved into nothing. The window, which usually opened onto the garden and street, now showed only a black void, dense and bottomless. She carefully approached the door. The floorboards creaked too loudly, though she could usually walk without a sound. Her heart pounded, her breath grew unsteady. When she stepped into the hallway, it felt as if something in the dark was watching her. The walls seemed alive. Strange shadows rippled across their surface, shadows that shouldn't have been there. "George!" Peppa called, but the only reply was her own voice echoing back at her, as if the house had too many empty rooms. She took a few steps toward the stairs, and just then, the lamp above her flickered. Light flared, then instantly died. But in that moment, Peppa saw a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. Tall, distorted, as though stretched out of the darkness. Its eyes glowed red, and from its mouth came a strange, low sound, an echoing, broken melody. "Tongue! Tongue! Saha!" the figure hissed. Peppa froze. Her legs felt rooted to the floor. Her heart stopped. Her mouth went dry. The creature lifted its hand and stepped forward. The floor groaned beneath it, but the footsteps sounded as if they came from several places at once. Peppa instinctively closed her eyes and pressed her ears with her hooves, but the melody only grew louder. She could hear it inside her head now, along with a whisper, "You're watching this, aren't you? Press the HYPE button below the video, or he'll come for you too." Peppa opened her eyes and screamed. The creature was closer now. Its movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Its face was too long, its mouth stretched too wide, and its eyes burned brighter and brighter red. She backed away, but the hallway grew longer. Each step didn't bring her closer to her room, but instead dragged her deeper into the house. Doors on either side opened on their own, and from each came the same whisper, "Tongue, tongue, Saha." Peppa ran to her parents' room and pushed the door open, desperate for safety. But the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, belongings carefully placed, as if her parents had never lived there. On the wall mirror, she saw not herself, but George. He stood motionless, his eyes hollow, his mouth moving, repeating the creature's words. Peppa stumbled back in horror. The mirror cracked, and George from the reflection stepped forward, trying to emerge. The girl screamed and bolted into the hall. Lights flickered everywhere, and each time they lit, the silhouette of Tung Tung Sahur appeared. Sometimes ahead of her, sometimes behind, sometimes right beside her. She burst into the living room. The television switched on by itself, showing only static, and from the speakers came the same melody. On the screen flashed her own face, twisted, foreign. Its lips moved, and it spoke. "You cannot escape." Peppa clamped her hooves over her ears, shut her eyes, pressed against the wall. But the sound only grew stronger. The air thickened around her, and every shadow in the room began to shift, stretching toward the center. The creature slowly emerged from the darkness. Its hands reached for Peppa, fingers too long, bent like hooks. It tilted its head, and its mouth split into a grin filled with alien, inhuman joy. "Tonight will not end," Tung Tung Sahur intoned. His voice echoed from the TV, from the mirror, from the shadows themselves. Peppa screamed, but her voice drowned in the roaring melody. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The world quaked around her, walls pulling apart and closing again, the ceiling rising higher, turning the house into an endless maze. The last thing she saw were the creature's burning red eyes. They loomed closer and closer until they filled her vision completely. And then came darkness, silence, and a whisper faint but clear. She's ours now. It all began with a small scratch on George's arm. He hurt himself while playing in the yard, and no one paid much attention. Mummy cleaned the wound. Daddy said it would heal by morning. But by the next morning, nothing had changed. More than that, Peppa noticed George had become different. He didn't laugh, didn't ask to play dinosaurs, didn't run after her in the garden. Instead, he sat by the window, staring off into the distance. His little fingers twisted a toy absent-mindedly, but his eyes, they were empty, as if he wasn't looking outside at all, but falling inward into endless darkness. "George," Peppa called softly. He turned his head slowly, and a smile flickered on his lips. But it wasn't her brother's smile. There was no warmth, no joy in it. It was something foreign. A chill ran down Peppa's spine. With each passing day, George grew quieter. He ate less and less, even refused his favorite ice cream. His skin paled, shadows deepened under his eyes. And one evening, Peppa caught a strange smell. It came from George, damp earth, mold, as if he had spent hours lying in some wet basement. She tried to tell their parents. "Something's wrong with George, he's scaring me." But Mummy only stroked her head. "Don't make things up, darling. George is just tired." Peppa knew. It wasn't tiredness. That night, a faint sound woke her. A soft scratching, like claws dragging across the floorboards. Peppa slowly sat up in bed and saw George. He was standing in the darkness in the middle of the room, motionless. Moonlight fell across his face, and his eyes reflected it, so that they looked completely white. "George?" Peppa whispered. He didn't answer, only tilted his head slightly and smiled again. The next few days were a nightmare for her. She was afraid to be alone with him. His presence made the air cold, as if he carried dampness into the house. Sometimes Peppa thought he had stopped breathing altogether. He sat still like a doll, and only minutes later would he take one long, heavy breath. And then, one night, what she feared most happened. A dull thud woke her. Peppa opened her eyes and saw George. He was lying on the floor, his body twisting as if something inside was breaking him apart. Two dark bulges pushed through his back with a sickening crack. They grew, tore through, and within moments became wings. Enormous, leathery, black. Peppa screamed, but no sound came out. George lifted his head. His hands were no longer hands. Long claws scraped against the floor. From his mouth came an inhuman cry. "I'm not George anymore!" A violent gust of wind shattered the window. With one beat of his new wings, George shot upward. Glass rained down. Wind roared into the room. Peppa shielded her face. When she dared to look again, her brother was gone. On the floor lay his toy dinosaur, smeared with black slime that spread slowly across the boards. Peppa collapsed onto the bed and wept. She didn't know where to run, what to do. Her parents, it seemed, hadn't even stirred from the noise. The next morning, no one spoke of George. His chair at the table was empty, but Mummy and Daddy acted as if it had always been so. "Where's George?" Peppa asked desperately. Mummy looked at her calmly. "We've only ever had you, Peppa." Those words struck harder than the nightmare itself. She realized George wasn't just gone physically. His very memory was being erased. But Peppa remembered. A few nights later, a knock woke her. Soft, deliberate, against the window. She slowly opened her eyes and saw him. George, but not him. His face was elongated. His eyes glowed a sickly yellow. Wings stretched behind him, blocking out the moonlight. His mouth opened, and from it came a whisper. "You're next, Peppa." She tried to scream, but her throat closed and no sound escaped. And then she saw Labubu. He was sitting on the windowsill. His eyes burned red. His smile was wider than ever. The toy shook his head slowly, as if saying, "I can't help you." Peppa pressed her hooves to her face, her heart pounding wildly. She knew then. George was only the beginning. Labubu was not there to protect her. He was part of this nightmare, and now he was waiting. It all started the day Peppa found a strange toy in her room. It was a Labubu, a small yellow monster with big black eyes and sharp teeth. Peppa couldn't remember where it came from. "What a cute toy! Where did you come from, little one?" she asked. Labubu remained silent, but his black eyes seemed to follow Peppa's every movement. That same day, a second window appeared in her room. The new window was old and dark, completely different from Peppa's usual window. Through the murky glass, instead of the familiar yard, there was a view of a gloomy, foggy forest. And strangest of all, in the forest grew trees that looked exactly like Labubu toys. "Mummy, look at this window and this strange forest," Peppa called out. But Mummy Pig replied, "Peppa dear, there's only one window in your room. And what's that toy you're holding?" Mummy couldn't see the second window, but even stranger, she couldn't see the Labubu toy either, even though Peppa was holding it right in front of her. On the first night, Peppa placed Labubu on her bedside table and went to sleep. But in the middle of the night, she woke up to a strange sound, the quiet grinding of teeth. In a quiet, creaky voice, Labubu whispered, "Peppa, Peppa, look out the window." You can talk," Peppa gasped. She turned to the second window. In the forest, she saw hundreds of small yellow figures, exactly like her toy. They stood between the trees, staring directly at her. Every night, the army of toy Labubus in the forest grew larger. They moved closer to the window, and their black eyes glowed in the darkness like little stars. "We've come for you, Peppa. You found us. Now we'll find you," Labubu said. "What do you want from me?" Peppa asked fearfully. "We want you to become one of us, forever," came the chilling reply. On the third night, Peppa woke up to find her hands had turned yellow, like Labubu's, and her eyes in the mirror seemed bigger and blacker than usual. "What's happening to me?" she cried. "You're becoming one of us. Soon you'll be able to live in our forest and we'll play forever," Labubu explained with a sinister smile. Peppa tried to throw away the Labubu toy, but it always returned to her room. She tried to close the second window, but it appeared on other walls. "Mummy! Daddy! Help me!" she screamed. But her parents couldn't see Labubu or hear his voice. To them, Peppa was just talking to herself. On the seventh night, the Labubu army came right up to the window. There were so many of them that the forest glowed with the yellow light of their bodies and the black gleam of their eyes. In chorus, they chanted, "It's time, Peppa. Time to join us." Peppa looked at herself in the mirror. Her skin had turned completely yellow. Her eyes were big and black, and the same horrifying smile as Labubu's appeared on her face. I'm ready," she said in a voice that now sounded like Labubu's. The second window opened by itself. Cold wind from the Labubu forest rushed into the room. Peppa, now looking more like a toy than a pig, stepped toward the window and disappeared into the night. In the morning, Mummy Pig came into Peppa's room to wake her up, but the bed was empty. On the windowsill lay only a small yellow Labubu toy with big black eyes. "Peppa, Peppa, where are you?" Mummy called out. She picked up the toy. For a moment, it seemed like Labubu winked at her and whispered quietly in a familiar voice, "I'm here, Mummy. I'll always be here." A week later, George found a strange toy in his room, a small yellow monster with big black eyes. And that same day, a second window appeared in his room. "Dinosaur! Dinosaur!" George exclaimed. "No, George, I'm Labubu, and soon you'll be Labubu too," the toy replied. In the forest beyond the window stood a figure that looked very much like Peppa, but with yellow skin and black eyes. She waved at George and smiled with Labubu's horrifying smile. "Be careful with toys that appear out of nowhere. Sometimes they don't come to be played with, but to turn you into a toy. Early in the morning, Peppa Pig's family set out for a picnic in the enchanted forest. Daddy Pig carried a heavy basket of food, Mummy Pig held George by the hoof, and Peppa ran ahead, promising to find the most secret place. On a meadow by the stream, they spread a blanket and laid out the treats. George already reached for the cake, but Daddy gently reminded him, "Vegetables first, George." After lunch, Daddy suggested hide and seek. "I'll count to 100, you hide." Peppa and George darted behind an oak and held their breath. But when they peeked out, there was only silence. No steps, no voices, even the stream seemed hushed. The sun leaned toward the horizon, and the forest grew unfamiliar. They tried to find the meadow again, but every path led back. Every tree looked the same. Darkness fell quickly. In a rock, they found a low, damp cave and hid inside. It smelled of moss and moisture. George whimpered and Peppa whispered, "We're together. We'll manage." Then branches cracked outside, closer and closer. In the darkness, 2 red sparks flared. They did not blink. There were old tales of the deer monster. Its antlers parted branches. Its steps shifted paths. A growl burst from the dark, shaking the ground. Peppa grabbed George. "Run!" They bolted and saw a light ahead, an old hut among the thickets. They rushed inside and slammed the crooked door. The air was heavy, the walls rotten. In the corner lay a chest, a rusty shovel and axe. Outside, something circled the hut and pressed against the threshold. Then the walls shook, struck by huge antlers. "Make noise!" whispered Peppa, and they banged on the pot and the chest lid. A guttural roar answered, and the door cracked. Moonlight fell through a hole in the roof. The children pushed the chest, climbed up, and scrambled onto the roof. Below, antlers scraped the walls. A thick branch of an old tree stretched nearby. "Jump!" cried Peppa. They clasped hands and leapt. The hut collapsed behind them, but the red eyes glowed again in the mist. On the branch they froze. The forest seemed to breathe. Far away flickered a warm light like the glow of their home. "Home!" George said with relief. They climbed down and ran. The wind carried scents of apples and wet bark, but suddenly from both sides came, "Peppa!" "George!" The voices were familiar, yet echoed with a delay. The light drew near, then slipped away. At last, they saw their house. The door opened. On the porch stood Mummy Pig. "Where have you been?" We were worried. Beside her was Daddy with a checkered blanket. In the kitchen it smelled of pie. The kettle whistled. "Vegetables first," Daddy said, and George nodded. They embraced, but Peppa noticed strange details. Mummy wore a different apron. The clock ticked oddly. Dry needles stuck from the rug. "We got lost," Peppa whispered. "Now you're home," Mummy replied, and the phrase seemed to echo faintly. That night, Peppa woke. Outside the window wasn't the yard, but forest. The moon hung between branches. On the glass lay a thin shadow shaped like antlers. "He found us?" George muttered in his sleep. In the morning, all looked normal. Daddy read the paper, Mummy set the plates. But the door opened not to the path, but to a narrow trail among spruces. On the windowsill lay 2 pine cones. In the hall remained wet prints shaped like branches. "Did we come back?" George asked. "Of course," Mummy smiled. Her smile was warm, but her lips seemed to repeat the motion again, like a reflection in water. By day, they tried to walk into the yard, but after a few steps, the path curved and brought them back to the porch. "It happens," said Mummy. The word echoed faintly. In the evening, Peppa saw a note on the fridge. "Vegetables first." Beneath it stretched a scratch, splitting at the end like antlers. At night, the house creaked like wood, smelling of resin. From deep inside came slow, endless counting. In the morning, Mummy said, "Today we'll stay home. The forest is tired." Daddy nodded. The mat by the door grew damp. Beneath it, roots were pushing through. "Home is good," said Peppa. George smiled. In the glass, their reflections doubled, as if two more stood beside them. Then the shadow blurred, and antlers lay across the pane. Since then, at night, the house smelled of forest. Sometimes trees stood outside the window. Sometimes the yard returned. No one spoke of the cave or the red eyes. But each time, Daddy said, "Vegetables first." A very close voice repeated the same words, with a delay. The deer monster no longer chased them through the thicket. He was already inside. The Labubu toy Peppa found a strange toy in an old chest in the attic. A small figure with big dark eyes and a wide smile. It had a tag, Labubu. The toy was soft but cold to the touch, as if it had been kept in a freezer for a long time. "Can I take it to my room?" Peppa asked Mummy Pig. "Of course, dear. But wash it first, it's very dusty." Peppa took Labubu to her room and placed it on the shelf next to her other toys. The toy stared straight ahead with an unmoving gaze. Something about its smile seemed wrong, too wide for such a small face. At night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound, quiet rustling, as if someone was crawling on the floor. She turned on the nightlight and looked around the room. Everything was in its place, but Labubu had disappeared from the shelf. "Where is it?" Peppa muttered, getting out of bed. She found the toy under the bed, lying on its side. Strange! How could it have gotten there? Peppa picked up Labubu and put it back on the shelf. The toy seemed heavier than before, and its smile had become even wider. The next day, Peppa was playing with George in the living room. Suddenly, she heard the patter of little feet upstairs. "Mummy, someone's walking in my room," Peppa said. "There's no one there, dear. Maybe it's mice." But when Peppa went up to her room, Labubu was not on the shelf again. This time, it was standing in the middle of the room, turned toward the door. Its pose was as if it had been waiting for Peppa. "How did you get here?" Peppa whispered, carefully approaching the toy. Labubu was silent, but its eyes seemed to follow Peppa's every movement. The girl quickly grabbed the toy and put it back on the shelf, but this time turned it to face the wall. At night, the rustling repeated, but now it was louder. Peppa woke up and saw that Labubu was standing by her bed, looking straight at her. In the darkness, its eyes glowed with a faint greenish light. "What do you want from me?" Peppa whispered, not daring to move. The toy didn't answer, but slowly raised one hand, as if it wanted to touch Peppa. The girl screamed and turned on the light. Labubu instantly became an ordinary toy lying on the floor. "Mummy! Daddy! What happened?" asked Mummy Pig, running into the room. "Labubu! It was moving! It was standing by my bed! It's just a toy, dear! It can't move!" But Peppa saw the truth in Labubu's dark eyes. The next day, she tried to throw the toy away, but it kept returning to her room. First in the trash can, then in the garden, even when Peppa took it to the neighbors. Labubu always found its way back. It began appearing in the most unexpected places. In Peppa's school bag, in the refrigerator, even in the bathroom. Each time its smile became wider and its eyes brighter. One night, Peppa woke up and found that all her toys had lined up in a row, looking at the bed. And in the center stood Labubu, like a commander of an army. "Now you understand," whispered a voice that seemed to come from all the toys at once. "I'm not just a toy, I'm a collector. And now you're part of my collection." Peppa wanted to scream but couldn't move. Her body was becoming stiffer, like a toy. She felt her skin turning to plastic and her thoughts slowing down. "Don't worry," said Labubu, coming closer. "Being a toy isn't so bad. You'll play forever. With me." In the morning, Mummy Pig found a new toy in Peppa's room, very similar to her daughter. It stood on the shelf next to Labubu, with the same wide smile and motionless gaze. Strange, "I don't remember buying this toy," Mummy Pig muttered, adjusting the little dress of the toy Peppa, and Labubu stood nearby, its smile even wider. Now it had a friend, forever. But Labubu's collection wasn't complete yet. In the evening, it heard George playing in the next room. It was time to find a new friend. Peppa Pig, the White Wolf, and Evie. A sense of unease settled over the pig household, something that no one dared to speak aloud. It all started subtly. The first few nights, Peppa would wake up to a strange sound. Maybe the wind was rustling in the trees, or perhaps claws were scraping across the floor. When she opened her eyes, it seemed like a shadow was moving in the corner of the room. But as soon as she blinked, the shadow was gone. One night, Peppa woke up with a sense of cold. Moonlight streamed through the window, and she saw it clearly for the first time. The white wolf. He stood still, head held high, his fur glowing in the dark as if he was woven from the very light of the moon. The wolf didn't growl or move. He just stared. His breath was heavy, burning cold. The next morning, Peppa told her parents, but they just smiled and said she must have dreamed it. Mummy Pig patted her on the head and said, "You were just scared of the dark." But deep inside, Peppa knew it wasn't a dream. With each passing night, the wolf's presence grew more insistent. At first, he glided across the walls as a shadow. Then his silhouette appeared by their bed. Peppa felt his breath touch her cheek. Sometimes she heard the faint sound of claws scraping the wooden floor. George would toss and turn in his sleep, mumbling, but when he woke, he couldn't remember anything. Then Peppa noticed that the wolf wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the small crib by the wall where little Evie slept. Normally, the baby slept peacefully, but now she often cried in the middle of the night. Her tiny body trembled, and it seemed like she felt the presence of the wolf more than anyone. One night, Peppa saw the wolf's eyes glow red. He stood right by Evie's crib, his muzzle lowering towards her face. The baby suddenly woke up and cried, but his gaze never left her. Peppa tried to scream, but her voice stuck in her throat. She ran to her parents, but they were sleeping so deeply, as if they had been enchanted. Days passed, and Evie changed. She stopped crying at night, but that was even scarier. She lay still, her eyes wide open, and her face had turned pale, as if drained of life. When Peppa looked into her eyes, it seemed like they were empty, glassy, and the baby was staring right through her. Peppa tried to convince Mum and Dad that something was wrong, but they just shook their heads. Sometimes at night, she heard them murmuring in their sleep. The words were soft, but she could swear they were repeating the same whisper, a distant howl. "He's waiting! He's waiting!" Then came the morning that changed everything. Peppa woke up and saw that Daddy Pig's bed was empty. His glasses lay on the nightstand, and the blanket was neatly folded. On the pillow was a piece of paper. The handwriting was uneven, as if written in a hurry. "Don't search for me. I'm with him now." Mummy Pig read the note and turned pale. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply sat down on a chair and stared at the wall for a long time. George didn't understand, but Peppa felt a chill spreading inside her. That night, everything became clearer. The room was unnaturally quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. The moonlight shone brightly, and its light fell directly on Evie's crib. There beside her sat the white wolf. His fur shimmered and his eyes glowed with a dull red flame. But the most terrifying thing was his smile, his muzzle twisted into a cruel, inhuman grin. Peppa stared at him, unable to move. The wolf wasn't in a hurry. He just sat next to Evie, as if waiting for her turn. Then his gaze slowly shifted to Peppa. She felt her heart tighten. In that moment, she understood. He would come for her too.